All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. My name is Heather Robidoux, and I am delighted to welcome you to the Fayetteville Public Library. We are thrilled to once again partner with the University of Arkansas Program in Creative Writing and Translation for our True Lit Literary Festival and to host this wonderful annual event in the Distinguished Reader. If you haven't already, take a look at our festival events. We do have another big week next week, including R.L. Stine. So if you grew up reading R.L. Stine, be sure and be here next Thursday. I would like to take just a moment to thank our festival partners, in addition to the university, the Fayetteville Public Schools, Fayetteville Public Education Foundation, and Altrusa International of Fayetteville. So with that, I'm going to officially turn things over to Yahida.
So good evening, everybody. I'm here to officially welcome you all to today's distinguished speaker event. I'm the current chair of the Department of English, so I'm here being the stand-in for our Director of Creative Writing this evening. I also have the job of thanking our sponsors as well on behalf of the program. So on behalf of the MFA program in Creative Writing and Translation, we would like to thank the sponsors of this event, which is the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences, the broader Department of English, the Walton Family Foundation, the James E. and Ellen Wadley Roper Professorship in Creative Writing, and the Fayetteville Public Library, who's partnering with us in this event. So now it's my job to turn it over to Caitlin Plant, who will be introducing our distinguished speaker this evening.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Plant, which was already said. I'm here to introduce Ladee tonight, our fall 2023 Walton Distinguished Visiting Reader. Ladee Hubbard writes uncompromisingly about race, family, community, exploitation, and trauma, both political and personal. As you read her work, its urgency reaches from the page and rests you from a slumber you didn't know you were in. She is the author of 2 novels, The Talented Ribkins, which received the 2017 Hurston-Wright Legacy Award for debut fiction, and the 2018 Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence, and The Rib King, which was named one of the most important books of 2021 by Time magazine. The Last Suspicious Holdout, her most recent collection of short stories, was praised in the New York Times as burning with unassailable truths. Ooh, sorry, y'all, I lost my place. Her short fiction and nonfiction have been published in the Arkansas International, whoop whoop, Oxford American, Guernica, Electric Literature, and the New York Times, among other publications, and is in the anthology Best American Mystery and Suspense 2023. She is the recipient of a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, the Berlin Prize, a Radcliffe Institute Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Award. She is the inaugural judge for the Arkansas International's 2023 Henry Dumas Prize. So please join me in welcoming Ladee Hubbard.
Thank you. That was really nice. And thank you for inviting me here. It's been really great. It's been lovely to talk to you guys and to have a chance to share my work with you. So I was going to read, because I saw them outside, so I was going to read from my first book, The Talented Ribkins, which means a lot to me. It's the main character in here is based on my grandfather, so I like reading from it because I was actually just saying that he is nothing like, my grandfather was a chemistry professor, so they were actually nothing alike, but the speech patterns, the character has the same speech patterns as my grandfather. So this is about, well, you know, I'm going to read the first chapter. It'll explain itself. All right. This is the Talented Ribkins, and the first chapter is called The Last Woman. He only came back because Melvin said he would kill him if he didn't pay off his debt by the end of the week. It was why he left St. Augustine, why he had no choice but to drive down to Lehigh Acres and dig up the box of money he'd buried in his brother's yard 14 years before. The only complication was his brother's last woman, who was still living in the house, because of course he didn't want her knowing what he was after, so he made something up. A toolbox, Johnny Ribkins said, standing on the splintered porch of a wood-frame two-story while hard slats of Florida sunshine bore down on his back and the woman squinted from behind the screen door. A toolbox, she said, gray grates masking her face like a veil. Why you got a toolbox buried in the yard? Oh, it's always been there, ever since we tore down the shed to build the basketball court. He nodded toward a weed-covered rectangle of cracked cement at the far corner of the yard. Just seemed like the safest place to put it at the time. A truck came barreling down the interstate on the other side of the fence, roar of exhaust merging with the mechanical drone of laughter coming from a TV playing inside the house. Johnny removed his hat, swatted at the moisture pooling across his brow, and stared at a rose tattoo that wound around the woman's neck. He hadn't seen her since his brother's funeral, but he had to admit she looked less crazy than he remembered. The lace top, miniskirt, and thigh-high boots were gone, replaced by a t-shirt, sweatpants, and white flip-flops. Her once gaunt cheekbones were now fleshy and jowly, and her hair, deprived of the bright red wig she'd worn to the wake, was gray and cut short. He figured she must have been in her 40s, about the same age his brother Franklin had been when he died. Johnny smiled. They old tools, see? Like for turning screws so old they don't even make them anymore. Truth is, I all but forgot about them until a couple weeks ago when I got a delivery of antique watches at the shop. He pulled a handkerchief from the pocket of his shirt and scratched at a line of sweat tickling his left ear. It was hot out there, and he could hear how lazy and exhausted his lies sounded. Luckily, the woman was none too bright. They valuable? Only if you a broken watch. A hearty amen and the sound of applause came from the TV inside the house. The tools aren't valuable, the watches are, but only if they're fixed. And really, it's more a matter of the fact that they don't make them anymore. Now, I've looked everywhere, even tried contacting the original manufacturer to see if I could get a hold of the designs to have copies made, and where was this going? Why was he wasting time trying to explain himself to some raggedy piece of interloping woman who didn't even have sense enough to invite him inside and out of the heat, which would have been simple courtesy? He didn't have time for this. He needed to find that money, get back to St. Augustine's, and so what, Johnny, you some kind of junk man now? Ain't no fucking junk man. It just popped out. But when he looked up, she was smiling. Her lip curled back to reveal the gold filling etched against her left incisor. I just thought because of the watches, you said they were old. They're antiques. He reached for his wallet. His hands were shaking as he pulled back the screen door and handed her his business card. Jonathan Ribkins, Acquisitions and Repairs, Ribkins Antiques. Family business, 2 generations. Didn't Franklin ever mention it? He worked with me for almost 12 years. No, we never discussed such things. She looked down at the card and then back at him. For a moment, he thought he saw something crafty in her eyes, a form of coherency that hadn't been there when he met her all those years ago, else he would have remembered it. Then the TV let out another amen, and he decided she must have found Jesus and gotten off the crack. She handed him back the card. You sure that's all you want? That's all, she sighed. All you Ribkins are so peculiar, she said, then stopped because there wasn't much more to say. She shuffled down the dark hall. He waited until she was in the living room, then positioned himself at the center of the bottom step and started walking straight ahead towards the interstate. And as he walked, he couldn't help but think about how sad it was to be digging through his brother's yard again after all this time. His half-brother, some 20 years his junior, whose existence he hadn't even known about until he was a grown man, when their father got drunk at a party one night and confessed there was another son, someone named Franklin, living with his mama out in the sticks, and Johnny had been the one to go find him. He thought about all he'd been through since Franklin died, how hard he'd tried to put this place behind him, only to find himself at the age of 72, right back where he'd started. This was especially troubling because Johnny made maps. That was his talent, not just what he did, but who he was, the same way his brother had scaled walls. Johnny made maps and Franklin scaled walls, and for 12 years they'd made their living by selling the things they found on the other side of those walls, right there in the antique shop Johnny inherited from their father. When he'd gone 20 paces, he cocked his head to the left and started moving diagonally towards a large oak tree at the far corner of the yard. All of that was supposed to have ended the day his brother died. He'd made a promise to stop stealing, start living right, start doing right, to try and remember what it meant to be a decent man. And everything seemed to be going according to plan until one day he looked up and realized that somehow in his grief he'd wound up working for a man who was under the mistaken impression that he owned Johnny. So here he was, 14 years later, crouched in the dirt, trying to dig up enough money to appease a criminal. He walked another 10 paces, then stopped and stared down at a small patch of dirt and clover. "You gonna fill it back up?" the woman called from the living room window. "I mean, when you finished?" "Of course," Johnny smiled. He was still smiling as she disappeared back into the shadow of a house built for someone else entirely. He hoisted his shovel. He needed the money. That was all there was to it, and there really wasn't any point worrying about the how and why of it now. But it was also true that he'd buried that box for a reason and was breaking a vow he'd made to himself by digging it up. And that, in some ways, was just as troubling as Melvin's threats. Because if all he'd tried to do since his brother left him hadn't been leading any place but right back here, then what was the point? And if he couldn't answer that question, couldn't make sense of his own path or justify his existence even to himself, then what was he doing crouched in the dirt, humiliating himself just to hold on? He put down his shovel and stared at an empty hole, aware that something didn't feel right. He had a near photographic memory, but he'd also stood on every inch of that yard, watched it from every conceivable angle, making it difficult to recall with any precision where exactly he'd stood when he first dug the hole he was looking for now. "Why you digging up that tree, old man?" A heavy-set, big-eyed girl in a red T-shirt and blue jean leggings was watching him from the other side of the fence. "What do you want?" "I don't want nothing." He reached into his pocket, grabbed a handful of coins, fished out the shiniest, and tossed it over the fence. The girl caught it with her left hand. "Now go on home." "I am home," the girl said. She pushed through the gate, walked up the front steps, and passed through the screen door. Johnny shook his head and wondered yet again why his brother's last woman had to be such a trifling mess. "Of course she's your brother's child. Doesn't she look just like him?" He was in the house now, standing in the dark hall while the woman stood in front of him with her arms folded in front of her chest. The girl sat in the living room watching TV. "Why didn't you say something?" "Say what?" the woman said. "This is the first time I've seen you in 14 years. How is I supposed to even find you? And anyhow, why? I don't need anything from you, Johnny Ribkins." Johnny looked at the girl slumped on the couch with her feet up on a rickety coffee table, surrounded by huge piles of junk. The whole house was jammed with drab furniture dragged in from who knows where. But worse than the things he didn't recognize were the things he did. The couch pushed against the far wall, his drafting table shoved in a corner underneath the TV set, the lamp with the crooked shade sitting on the floor near the window. Tokens of a distant past he'd all but forgotten, yet somehow knew were out of order. "You're still living in my brother's house. This rat trap, in the middle of nowhere, I can't even sell it." He felt something tense in his chest and glanced towards the yard. "Listen here, woman, you got no right to be selling anything. The name is Meredith, old man, and I already told you I can't. But speaking of rights," she turned to her daughter, "honey, why don't you go upstairs for a minute and start packing?" "But I'm not going anywhere." "Get upstairs anyway. Anyhow, let me talk to your uncle." The girl sucked her teeth and stomped out of the room. "You heading somewhere?" "Why?" "I'm just asking." "Yeah?" She narrowed her eyes. "Look, man, you might as well go ahead and tell me what your intentions are, because this is a common law state. Do you know what that means?" He did. He stared at the crooked lampshade. "It means I got the same legal rights as a proper wife. Understand? Now, I don't want any trouble from you, but I've been living out here for going on 14 years now, so I'm going to tell you just like I told the bank. Whatever claim to this place you might think you have, you can just forget about. This is my house, and it was the heat. The heat of her presence, worse than the heat outside. He could feel his breathing catch in his throat, his blood pressure rise, even as he told himself to keep cool and remember why he was there. Melvin had given him just 1 week to come up with $100,000 he needed to pay off his debt. And a part of him knew that the only reason he'd been given even that much time was because Melvin didn't believe Johnny could do it, was just waiting for him to fail. But that was because Melvin didn't know about the hole Johnny had dug, which is to say, how selfish he'd been before his brother died. I just want my tools, Johnny cried, then stopped because he could feel himself about to give away how badly he wanted them. He reached for the handkerchief in his pants pocket, put his head down and patted his brow, trying to channel the appearance of a harmless old man who was confused or anyhow peculiar enough to have come all that way to fetch some worthless junk. And all at once it occurred to him that maybe he was just a harmless, peculiar old man, hunched over, blinking back confusion and grief as he stood in the dark hall of a house he'd helped his brother build, yet had given up any claim to long ago. Johnny Ribkins, you may not stay here indefinitely digging up holes in my yard. Yes, I understand. I just need a little more time. I got distracted by the girl, and it's hot out there. Meredith opened the door and made a sweeping gesture with her hand. Her name is Eloise, by the way, in case you were curious. She shut the door. Johnny put his hat back on. He stood on the porch for a moment, trying to absorb the quiet of the world outside. Then he took a deep breath, eased himself onto the top step, and stared at his empty hole. Strange and pitiful. That was what his life had become. His current circumstance was undignified, but if he was honest with himself, no more so than the circumstance that had preceded it, selling his maps to Melvin Marks. That was the part that should have never gotten started. But decent man or no, he still had to make a living. After Franklin left, he couldn't bring himself to go back to working alone, so he'd started working for someone else, sitting in a small room, drawing up blueprints, waiting for his share. Of course he was getting ripped off, but when he tried to get out of it, Melvin wouldn't just let him leave. Oh, you're not going anywhere, Johnny Ribkins, so you might as well sit your ass back down. You signed a contract when you came to work for me, and I can tell you exactly how much it would cost to buy yourself out because, you see, I have it all written down. So after a while, Johnny started giving himself little wage adjustments. Whenever an unexpected expense came up, it wasn't hard to find ways to simply take what he needed. This he did not consider stealing because, in truth, it was always far less than what he was owed. It was just a fact that Melvin was getting rich off Johnny's maps, so rich that for a long time he didn't even notice how much Johnny was skimming off the top. It seemed to keep everybody satisfied, and for a while everybody was happy, right up until the day Johnny got caught. The door swung open and Eloise shouted, "It's like 100 degrees out there. I'm 13 and I don't like shrimp," then sprinted past him down the steps. She ran over to the other side of the yard and started playing by herself, throwing rocks in the air, then spinning around and catching them in alternate hands, all the while weaving in and out of the sunlight flashing through the branches of the oak tree. Pull yourself together, Johnny thought. There was nothing to be done about his current situation except be a man about it. He needed to focus, remember where he'd buried that money, then get back to St. Augustine and deal with Melvin as quickly as possible. That was the way the Ribkin brothers worked, in and out, no flinching, no fucking around. Johnny blew up blueprints not just for the walls he could see, but also for the walls behind those walls, and his brother hiked his pants and scaled them. Later on, Franklin would tell Johnny how he'd been exactly right, how he'd turned a corner or pushed through a door, and the passageways in Johnny's pictures seemed to magically appear. "How do you do that?" Franklin sometimes said. Just like sometimes Johnny asked Franklin how he managed to get up there, get up and over that wall or fence or window ledge, and then come back to show Johnny whatever it was he'd found on the other side. The truth was, Johnny had been drawing up blueprints of buildings he had no access to since before he could read, and Franklin had scaled walls the way other boys masturbated, for years never managing to accomplish much with this miraculous skill beyond a series of trespassing and petty theft charges. No reason for it, just something they'd always been able to do that never made much sense and only rarely seemed useful. Until one day they found each other, and for a while, everything seemed to click. "Are you really my daddy's brother?" The girl was watching him from the shade of the oak tree. "So I'm told. Can you prove it?" "Who else would I be?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. You got some kind of identification? Let me see your driver's license." He reached into his wallet and handed her a business card. "Satisfied?" "Mama says you wouldn't have come around unless you wanted something. She said Ribkins are real good at looking out after their own, but they don't care a thing about anyone else. That's why she doesn't want you in the house. She's worried you might get confused, start thinking you might as well stay." "Yes, I caught that." "Is it true?" "No." "Where y'all headed off to?" "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." She got a job working on a riverboat for the shrimp festival out in Clearwater. She does it every year, but I already told her I'm not going this time. I'm staying right here. I'm 13 now. I can take care of myself. "Okay," Johnny said. He heard a whistling sound and turned his head. A group of children had gathered by the gate and were calling Eloise towards them. "You know, you don't look a thing like my daddy's picture. Plus, you're old. If you two were brothers, how come you're so old?" "That's something you'd have to take up with another party, now isn't it? Seeing as how I didn't have much to do with it." He smiled. "We were brothers, all right. Half-brothers, on the Ribkins side. Trust me, we had enough in common in the ways that count." She handed the card back. "No, you keep it." She slipped it in her pocket, then turned around and ran across the yard. Johnny knew the girl was telling the truth. He was old and tired. For all he knew, it was a sign of this very infirmity that he seemed to keep forgetting how old and tired he actually was. He looked back at the hole. He stood up, positioned himself on the bottom step, and started walking again, this time channeling the cocky stride of his much younger self. He narrowed his eyes, pursed his lips, and tilted his shoulders so that his left side rolled back below his right. He dropped his hip and let his legs slide out in front of him, then sidled across the yard in this manner for a full 20 paces. When he stopped, he realized he was almost twice the distance farther than his careful, plodding steps had taken him earlier. He cocked his head to the left, then took 10 more winding steps toward the oak tree. He hoisted the shovel and started digging. "Yes, sir," he thought. "How you think I got this old? Been around for years, and trust, this ain't nothing. If there's one thing you do know, it's how to survive this world. Johnny Ribkins always lands on his feet." He lowered his shovel and felt the sudden crack of metal against metal. He got down on his knees and pulled out a rusted box. "Thank you," he said out loud. He glanced over his shoulder. Eloise was standing on the other side of the fence, leaning against a telephone pole that rose up at the edge of the highway, while a boy crouched down in front of her, reached inside a book bag, and pulled out 2 large cans of cut corn. She shut her eyes and made an OK signal with 2 fingers of her left hand. The boy stood up, leaned back, and hurled the cans as hard as he could, straight towards Eloise's head. "No!" Johnny gasped. By the time he understood what was happening, Eloise was holding the first can in front of her face. Her eyes popped open as her left hand floated up just in time to catch the second. "It's all right, mister. She caught it. See? She always catches it." The boy smiled. "We just playing." Johnny turned back towards the house. "They just playing," Meredith said. They were in the living room, Johnny standing next to the TV while the girl sat slumped on the couch, and Meredith glared at him with her hands on her hips. They were throwing cans. "You think I like it? You think I haven't tried?" "I can't get her to stop." "That's your job, isn't it? You're her mother. You're supposed to make them stop." "You're not listening. It's not my fault, and it's not them. It's her. You know how many times I've told her to quit showing off? Can catch anything you throw at her, can block any punch. They all say it, and from what I've seen, maybe it's true. That doesn't mean I like it, and it sure doesn't make it right, but that's the truth of it. The only reason those children keep trying to hit her is because they think they can't." She straightened her back. "Now, you and I both know damn well it's just some fucked up Ribkin thing she inherited from her daddy." Johnny nodded. "Yes, indeed, a Ribkin thing. Tell the truth." All you Ribkins got something peculiar about you. Franklin told me all about it. You think it's easy trying to deal with something like that? I keep telling her, all you got to do is let one of them hit you just one time. Then it'll stop of its own accord because folks will know it's not true. But see, she doesn't want to stop. She's showing off. She thinks it makes her look cool. Stop it, Mama, the girl shouted. I can hear you, Stop talking about me. Also, I see you found your damn toolbox, Meredith said. He looked down at the battered steel box in his hands. That mean you finished? Because I'm trying to be nice. But the truth is I got things to do, and you've been here all day. He looked at Eloise. What could he do? She was Franklin's child, all right, and a Ribkins. Maybe if he was a younger man with less debt, that would have meant something more. But the way he lived, the people he hung out with, some of whom at that moment would have thought nothing of doing him great bodily harm? No, she was better off here. Both of them safer with him pushing on. Probably should hit the road before it gets dark. That sounds about right. He frowned. I'll be back, though. You hear me? I'm coming back to check up on my niece. It's not really your concern. It is, though. You're going to have to try a little bit harder to be responsible. He nodded to 2 large duffel bags sitting by the door. You can't leave that child here while you're off gallivanting on some riverboat. Not when you know the kind of foolishness she's liable to get herself into. Gallivanting. It's called work. It's a job, and I need the money. All I know is that is no way for a little girl to play. She could get hurt. It's not funny. No, it's not, Meredith said. You want to know what is funny? Me winding up alone and stuck in the middle of nowhere for the past 14 years. Me working my ass off 6 days a week trying to take care of that girl and keep food on the table, only to have some bank tell me I got to come up with $20,000 or they'll repossess the house. But what's really funny is you showing up after all this time trying to talk to me about being responsible. She shook her head. Where you been, Johnny Ribkins? What makes you think you've got the right to tell anyone how to raise a child? He looked down at the box. How much you owe on the house? None of your damn business. Johnny nodded. I guess I probably should be going. That's what I've been trying to tell you, Meredith said. Johnny took his box and drove to Fort Myers. He checked himself in at a motel, had a nice dinner, and then went to his room and counted his money. When he was certain he had what he needed to satisfy Melvin, he climbed into bed and clicked on the TV. He sat through 2 episodes of Law and Order and then switched to 24-hour news coverage of the upcoming election cycle. They were interviewing candidates running for Senate, and he happened to catch a few minutes of a man named Dawson droning on about his prospects. I know there were some who were surprised when I threw my hat back into the ring, given the fallout from my last campaign, but do you know I receive letters every day from people who need help, who need someone to stand up for them? So that's why I came back, because I was called. When he'd had enough of that, he turned off the TV and lay down on his bed, but he could not sleep. He tossed around for what seemed like hours, and every time he shut his eyes, he heard Meredith's voice, just let them hit you in the head one time. Now, what kind of thinking was that? Yet he couldn't get it out of his mind. He looked up at the ceiling. It was hearing his people called peculiar that had him rattled, as if there was something wrong with them. If what Meredith said was true, then Eloise was gifted, unique, and Meredith was right. That was something a lot of folks in the family shared, little sparks of something special that didn't seem to make much sense, and it generally caused more confusion than anything else. Because not knowing what to do with these gifts, many of them had spent years trying to understand them, to figure out where they belonged and who they were. They were Ribkins. Johnny sat up. His father had been blessed and burdened with the ability to see in the dark. He had a cousin who could spit firecrackers and whose daughter could talk to fish. Another cousin had a son whose one true joy was picking locks. And of course, his grandfather had had that sense of smell, the source of his great wealth and eventual undoing. But it's where the name came from. The girl's great-grandfather was the original Rib King, said to have invented the best barbecue sauce recipe in the entire Southeast. As a result of all his sniffing around after the theft of said recipe, he'd eventually felt compelled to hide. But he couldn't really let go. No one, Johnny imagined, had ever had a better excuse to take an alias than his grandfather, but he'd wanted that trace of memory to remain. When they told stories, when they said it out loud, when they got to remembering who they were. And so they were the Ribkins, born of the rib, still of the rib, and this here, your flesh and bone. He stood up, walked to the dresser, and rifled through the motel stationery looking for an envelope. When he found one, he opened the toolbox, pulled out a few bills, and stuffed them inside. He put his hat back on. A Ribkins. He owed a debt, was all. And that might have changed his circumstance, but it couldn't change who he was. Meredith Sue Clark sat alone in the living room thinking about what Johnny had said about letting folks throw cans at her girl. Even if Eloise never flinched, even if the blows never connected, Meredith could feel them, and she wanted it to stop. The doorbell rang. She peeked through the blinds and saw a 72-year-old man with stooped shoulders standing on her front porch, hat in hand. She walked across the hall and opened the door. Johnny reached into his pocket. "I've been thinking about Eloise. Take her," Meredith said. Thank you. So that was the first chapter of that song. So I don't know. If anyone has questions, I got. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. There's a reason I wrote this. So when I taught before at Tulane, I taught in Africana Studies, and I would teach the essay by Du Bois, The Talented Tenth. So I don't know. Do you want me to explain what the Talented? So it was written in 1903. By W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was actually an argument to make a liberal arts education available to Black people in the South at a time when a lot of people thought it was counterproductive for Black people to have an education at all. And so his argument for why this needed to happen was that there was a tenth of the population that was in sort of born with the natural superior abilities that would make them the leaders of the Black race, right? And that was his argument. So a lot of times when I taught it, people would be like, oh, it's so elitist, and Du Bois is so elitist. And I was thinking about my grandfather because he went to one of these schools it was called North Carolina Central, and the only reason it was there was because of the efforts of people like Du Bois. And he walked there, and he worked in the kitchen for several years before he could afford to take classes, and he wound up a chemistry professor. So when I thought of what that essay meant, it meant totally different things to me, and also I think education was so, in my family, it was so integral a part of our identity, right? It just was, and I say this is in the starkest term, and I think it's true of a lot of Black families, actually, because my grandparents always said, that is the one thing no one can ever take away from you, is what you know. What is in your head and in your heart, no one can take that away from you. So education was really, really important. So I wanted to write about my grandfather, and also in relation to, he definitely, in part the point was that he definitely did not come from a very elite, like a Black elite family. These family they were like sharecroppers, and I also really loved that you don't make a lot of money as a chemistry professor, so it's like he worked literally it was because this is what he was passionate about and what he thought was beautiful. So that it has a epigraph from Du Bois, and this is from the essay. Now the training of men is difficult and intricate tasks. Its technique is a matter for educational experts, but its object is for the vision of seers, which I think is really beautiful. So this was a way of me talking about sort of the idea of a leadership class, and also the sort of really important difference between talent and vision, because it doesn't really matter how much talent you have without a sense of vision, too. They're not the same thing. So that's what that's about. And then it's funny because I realized in that I knew this before, but I forgot kind of there's a mention of the Rib King, which became the subject of my second novel. It's just a historical novel about a man that invents a meat sauce and spends his life touring the country as the Rib King. So giving cooking demonstrations. So. Well, I don't know. Does anyone have? You don't have to have questions. Yeah.
Do you have a knack? Like a talent, like that?
Oh gosh. Oh no. No, I don't think so. I don't know. I don't know what my talent would be. I don't think so.
Well, I was wondering because you said it. Well, I guess you said he's nothing like your grandpa.
No, but he
is. The idea of the little weird talent is.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know where I got. I mean, no, I don't think I do. Maybe I do. I don't know. So, but. Oh yeah.
I'm interested in knowing why you have your book set in Florida, if you're from Louisiana.
I'm not from Louisiana at all. I'm not really from Florida either. My grandparents lived there, and I spent my summers with them. So that's why, because this one is, again, it's about my grandfather, so it is. And then the Last Suspicious Holdout, I think a lot of them are based in that town in Florida too, really. No, they're St. Petersburg. Yeah. And but also there is some New Orleans in there. So there is a politician who hid stuff in the freezer in his garage. Like there's a character in here that's New Orleans. Which I thought was really funny because he said no one would look there. No one looks in the freezer in his. Anyway, so there's some New and all the stuff with the interstate pertains more to New Orleans too, because they did that in Treme. There's a neighborhood called Treme, and they built the interstate right through it, and so yeah, so it's kind of an imaginary place, but that's a mix of those. But I didn't actually grow up either place, so I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So yeah.
Can you make a conscious decision to write about, the South as opposed to New England, or like how did that come about for you in that individually?
I don't know. That is such an interesting question. Because I don't actually know. I do write about the South a lot. I mean, I've lived there for a while. I've lived there for a long time, and I think also. And I seem to be repeating the pattern of moving a lot. My mother moved a lot. So we lived in Cambridge, and we lived in Oakland, California, and then we lived in the Virgin Islands, and then I went to high school in upstate New York. So I moved a lot. So for me, like, stability was really the summers I spent with my grandparents, even though, like, you know what I mean? Like, I never went to school there or anything like that. So it just, I think it had a big influence on me, clearly, spending that much time there. So, yeah.
Earlier during the craft talk, you spoke a lot about how music influences your work and how dance has been so integral to you. And I wondered, when you're writing your chapters, do you think about them sometimes in like the same terms as like scoring, like a set of music, because there's such a rhythmic quality to it?
I do think about that. I think about that. I think it's like if I can't find, and I call it structure, but it actually is rhythm. I actually am thinking about rhythm a lot of times. It's like I can't really get into what I'm doing until I figure that out. Like that's part of what I'm always trying to find. And I don't know, I danced for a long time, so I don't know if that's part of it. Like I'm sure it is, because everything affects everything. It's who you are, do you know? But yeah, no, that actually is like a big part of finding the story, is sort of figuring out the rhythm, which is the structure. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. Yeah.
You talked a lot about like beginning with like tone and character, and now like rhythm and structure. What's that process of like coming to plot? Like, do you begin kind of with this character that sort of like try to figure out what they're up to, and that kind of snowballs into a plot?
Yeah, that is so interesting. I don't know, because I don't think I am inherently good at writing plots, but I mean, that was like the hardest thing for me, was to figure out how to just tell a straight story. I actually went through a period where I read a lot of detective fiction, just because I felt like it seemed so impossible to me, and I didn't understand it. Like, I didn't understand plots at all. So that actually was really helpful. Like, I just sort of made myself read tons of things that were sort of dependent on, and it was detective fiction. That's what I read, and that was really helpful. So I don't know. I do often, it's like an idea, and then it's like trying to find a story that will dramatize it in a way that makes sense for me. So someone was asking about this, because I do write that way. I try to, I do like stories, and I like all these other things, but often I feel like I write because I'm trying to figure out what I think about something. Like, that's usually where it starts, like a book. Do you know? It's like I'm trying to, it's just something I'm trying to figure out. And somehow, like, dramatizing it in a certain way kind of helps me to understand what I think about it or what it means to me. Do you know? Okay. Yeah.
On behalf of the University of Arkansas MFA program in creative writing and translation, I would love to thank our 2023 Distinguished Reader.
Thank you.
Remarkable reading. Thank you so much. And
Thank
you all
you.
for being here tonight. There are books for sale right outside the door. Ladee's going to sign those books for you, and you should take some of those next time.
Great. All right, thank you. Really fun. Yeah, cool.